You now have a good fundamental knowledge of Blazor components. In this module, we're using that to dive into other practical features that you need to know of before starting building a production quality Blazor application. A very powerful one is called chained binds. This feature enhances two-way data binding so that a child component's property can be bound to a property of the parent component. So what does that mean and how is it useful? Let me show you another example to make things clear. In the benefit selector so far, we used an input element of the date type to let the user enter the end date. We used the add-bind syntax to do a two-way data binding between the value of the input and the end date property of the benefit. But according to the new requirement that just came in, we have to make the date input a little bit smarter. It has to render a button next to it, and when the user selects a different date and presses the button, the value should revert to the original date. This is more than a standard input element can give us. So it makes sense to create a new component around the input with this functionality. With a new component, the new functionality will be nicely isolated and reusable. Here's the new date field component, which I've added to the component library. A component like date field is generic enough to be used across different applications. So I've added it to the components library project we created earlier. And in this case, it uses a code block in the Razor file instead of a code behind file. You can see it has a date property that is bound to the value of an input using one-way data binding. Inputs just accept strings, not datetime objects, and the conversion is done on the fly. The add-bind syntax we used earlier on the input element automatically takes care of conversion, but now we have to take care of it ourselves. The onChange event on the input is also handled. We'll get to more of the code of date field in a minute, but first, here's a question for you. When I replace the input field used for the end date with the date field component in the benefit selector, how should I bind a property of a benefit object to the date property of the date field component? Using add-bind syntax perhaps? Well, that won't work because that is designed to work with input elements only. So maybe we can pass in the datetime object. That wouldn't work because any changes date field makes on the object wouldn't be visible to the parent component, because datetime is a struct, which is a value type. Passing in the benefit model object to the date field perhaps, and simply change the property in the date field component. But can you see the downside of that? It would make date field dependent on the benefit model class. We want it to be usable with any date functionality. We need a better solution, and this is where chained binds come in. Date field has a property called date marked as a parameter, in combination with an event callback called dateChanged, also decorated with parameter. Because of that, we can now use add-bind-date in the benefit selector, which is the parent component, establishing two-way data binding between the date property in date field and the end date property of a benefit in this case. Now what if we would change the event callback name? Would that still work? No, the naming pattern should be property name changed. The property name, by the way, could be anything. I could call it day, for example, and change the name of the callback to dateChanged. Multiple properties like this are allowed too for more complex components. Now let's zoom into the code of date field. There's the input I showed you earlier with a one-way data binding to the date property. And when the date is changed, the onChange event fires that triggers the onDateChanged method. In onDateChanged, we get the new value by using changed event args. We convert the string to a datetime object and assign it to the date property. In the last line, the event callback is fired that notifies the parent, in our case the benefit selector, of the fact that the date has changed. And while doing that, it passes in the new date value. So this establishes true two-way data binding. Now for the revert functionality, there's a method called revert that fires when somebody clicks the button. When the date is different, the date changed event handler is fired with the original date. The ORECDate property is set when the component initializes.